Hi folks, lucky enough to be joined by the one and only Richard Pyle of fish hunting geek fame and squeaky voice cold water fame. Richard, great to see you.
Nice to see you. Thank you for having me here.
Yeah, thanks for taking the time to talk to us and to all the readers of Rebreather World, or viewers. We're high tech. So, new Poseidon, eh?
Yeah, let me give you a quick short version of the history of where this thing came from and how it came to be. Basically, the person who now owns Poseidon got interested in the idea of a recreational rebreather, a different kind of rebreather. And through a series of conversations between him and Barry Coleman and subsequently Paul Heinrich, he was led to Bill Stone, the designer of the Cislunar Mark V rebreather. And Curt decided that what was needed for the market, and persuaded us of the same, was that there needs to be a low-end recreational sport diver for the masses.
I think that's where the gap is right now.
It seems to be. It took a lot of persuasion. Bill and I and Nigel Jones, who is also on the design team of this, who's the guy who designed the electronics of the Cislunar series of rebreathers before, were very skeptical. We weren't quite sure the world was ready for this sort of thing. So we had a meeting in Bill's living room to sort of discuss the framework. What would this rebreather look like? What features would it have? What would it not? And it started out as basically a mini Mark V. Taking some ideas, but then, of course it would have a secondary display. Of course it would have 3 sensors, duh.
3 sensors? Let me just, so what's your take on the whole 2 sensor thing?
Bill describes that better than I do in an engineering perspective, but I'll just give you sort of my own thought process that went from the 3 sensor world to where I'm thinking now. And as a rebreather diver, we all know the golden rule is know your PO2 at all times, right? I mean, I said that in one of my very earliest articles about rebreather diving. It's rule number 1, know your PO2 at all times. And I've also been quoted in magazine articles saying that there's only one computer on a rebreather that matters, and that's the computer between the diver's ears. Because, there's a lot going on. You can't just look at a display, see some PO2 value readings, and say, that's my PO2. You have to read a little more into it to decide not just whether or not those sensors are giving you a value that's safe, but whether or not they're giving you the value you're actually breathing. So there's some interpretation that a well-trained rebreather diver will take some readings and interpret whether or not that's the value that's actually going into their lungs. So now, let's get back to this 3 sensor thing. So 3 sensors. Well, since the Electrolung, all electronic rebreathers have had 3 sensors. Why? Because all electronic rebreathers have had 3 sensors. And there's some very good logical reasons for that. I mean, the obvious redundancy thing. But then there's also this voting logic, right? 1 sensor tells you nothing. 2 sensors still tells you nothing, because if they don't agree with each other, you don't know which one to believe. So in theory, 3 sensors is the tiebreaker that allows you to know what you're actually breathing. So that's sort of our mindset. And when we designed the original concept for a sport rebreather, it had 3 sensors in it. And then Nigel Jones raised his hand at sort of the discussion meeting about this and said, why 3 sensors? Well, I just gave him the whole spiel I just gave you. He says, all right, so here I am, I'm writing the code, okay, the software code that receives this value. And let's say the software receives 2 sensors reading 1.4 bar and 1 sensor reading 0.7 bar. What am I, the computer software, going to do with that information? And then we went around the room with some very experienced rebreather divers. And the first person said, well, it's obvious. Your PO2 is 1.4. You discard the other reading because, voting logic. And someone else said, no, but I've had 2 sensors fail on me before when it's been trapped by condensate. So you're not quite sure that that's the right reading. You have to keep in mind that, you have to look at which one is dynamic. If the 0.7 is dynamic, then you trust that one over these 2 static readings of 1.4. Someone else says, well, yeah, but you can't trust that because you don't know why it's dynamic. Maybe it's a loose connection. So anyway, we went down the line and all these different rationalizations of what you do with 2 readings of 1.4. And the fact is, nobody agreed exactly what you do with that information. And what that means is that information is not real information. It's pseudo-information. So having 3 sensors is almost like, there's certainly some redundancy. I would say it's certainly better than 1 sensor. But 3 sensors that you can't trust is only marginally better than 1 sensor or 2 sensors that you can't trust. The answer to all of that is something that I give Bill credit for really discovering, and it's one of the unsung features of the cislunar series rebreathers, which is the fact that if you have a known fraction of oxygen in your diluent tank, and you have a known depth because you have a depth sensor, and you have a mechanism to expose your oxygen sensors to that known FO2, you can reality check your sensors at any time during the dive. So one of the great features of the cislunar Mark V is you can blow a burst of diluent straight on the oxygen sensors and reality check whether or not those sensors are giving you accurate, honest readings. That's better than not having that feature, but it's not the perfect solution because it's very crude. You know, how much volume you blast depends on how long your thumb is depressing that. You know, you're blowing lots of gas in there. It's a very uncontrolled sort of, and then you got to use your brain, and you've only got one point to verify and all of that. So it was that concept we thought we took to the next level with this system in devising a system where, well, I'll let Bill describe the technical details of it, but essentially we can now verify within the tolerances of laws of physics, within that, you know, margin of error, that this sensor is giving us not just accurate readings at one PO2, but accurate readings at the entire scale of PO2 values that you're ever going to experience as a rebreather diver. And so what sprung from that is, well, if you've got one sensor that you can now trust with great reliability, what are those other sensors really telling you? And what is the value you're getting by having multiple sensors that do the same thing? So it was that logic that sort of led us into this brave new world of, you know, and so people say, well, why two? It sounds like, oh, well, you save $70 because now you don't have to buy 3 new sensors. No, it has nothing to do with cost saving. What it has to do with is reliable information and understanding what your PO2 is, knowing your PO2. And we feel the only way you can truly do that is to validate that oxygen sensor, not just before the dive when you calibrate, not after the dive, but through the dive. And I'll let Bill explain the details of all of that. So that's where it comes from. It's not a cheap thing. It's not a cost-saving thing. It's a whole new way of using sensor data to tell you what you're actually breathing.
Okay, great. Other features.
Let me talk about this bit right here, which I think is a pretty slick piece of engineering, and I wish I could take credit for it. We can't. I'll give you a little bit of history. When I was first trained to dive on the cislunar Mark IV rebreather by Bill, you know, I would send him these emails every other day saying, hey, here's a great idea, you should do this, you should do that, like any rebreather diver would. And one of those ideas I had was, well, if you've got an open circuit bailout regulator built into your DSV already, and it's got a mechanism that's a diaphragm triggered lever that, you know, pressure compensated, why can't it also be the ADV? Why not get rid of the ADV and have your open circuit regulator double as an ADV when in closed circuit mode? And Bill said, been there, done that, doesn't work. And he went to this long explanation and persuaded me that it won't work. And what it boils down to is for an open circuit regulator to give you gas at a tolerable performance, it is so sensitive that it's way too sensitive to be an ADV. You end up just filling your loop. Every inhalation breath you get a little micro triggering, and then that'll inject gas. So it's, you know, if it's sensitive enough to be a good open circuit regulator, it's too sensitive to be an ADV. So when we got involved with Poseidon, and Bill and I were talking to those Poseidon engineers, bang, this idea came up again. We're putting an open circuit regulator on the mouthpiece. Why can't it be the ADV? Been there, done that, doesn't work, X, Y, Z. And I said, the only way it would work is if somehow, with the same mechanism that you change from open circuit to closed circuit, you also desensitized the triggering cracking pressure of the regulator. And all it took was that suggestion. And back came this design, which I think is really a marvel. It's really nice. So this is your valve that switches you from closed circuit mode to open circuit mode. So it's a fairly simple A to B. And it does two things. One, you can see that it's changing the gas pathway that you're breathing. So it's changing your inhalation path from here, the rebreather loop, to here, the open circuit supply. But it does something else clever. If you get in really close here and you rotate this, you'll see that not only is it spinning, but it's lifting laterally. So what's happening is, when you go into closed circuit mode, it's backing the trigger of the piston valve away from the diaphragm, so that the pilot valve is less sensitive when you're in closed circuit mode, and it was tuned to match the cracking pressure of the cislunar ADV valve. So in other words, it functions as an ADV valve in this position, functions as an open circuit regulator in this position. It's really slick. And again, I wish I could take credit for it, but
what about the display? Very different to what we usually see.
Yeah, very different. A little bit large in this prototype here. I'm sure it'll shrink down, but it's still way smaller than the Mark V was. We used to call that the brick. This, I guess we'll call this one the ping pong paddle or something. I'm not quite sure what we'll end up calling this. But again, this was, the original idea, we came up with 5 versions of the layout of the information. The battery's not charged, so I can't show you this now. You can probably get it outside. Came up with 5 different versions. It ranged from Club Med stupid all the way up to rebreather diver stupid. So there's 5 levels of stupidity in diving. And what level of stupidity are we aiming for on this market? We kind of ended up, well, it's really the bottom tier that Poseidon's interested in, Club Med stupid. So the philosophy was only give the diver the information they need to know, give it to them in an extremely simple and easy to read form, and give them very intuitive signals when something's amiss. And we could go over the individual elements, but basically this design was designed to be, at a glance, you immediately know if everything's okay or not okay for someone who isn't a hardcore rebreather diver.
Electronics, really interesting. What about a heads-up display? That seems to be the norm these days.
Well, it's got a heads-up display. It's not in this unit right now because the unit they have didn't have a long enough cable to reach, but they have one out here on the floor you can take a look at. But yeah, that's the best way to get, one of the best ways to get the diver's attention. Now,
can you tell your PPO2 is a
no,
okay,
no,
red
it's
badge.
got one function and one function only, which is time to end the dive now.
Okay.
It's actually got a subtler function than that, which is change your mouthpiece position. One of the nice things about this is that there's actually a way that this communicates with the HUD, so the electronics know what position this valve is in. And that way, if the system recognizes that you need to be on an open circuit bailout, and it senses that this is in closed circuit, it'll flash at you, and not only flash, it'll vibrate. Kevin Jurgensen patented a really clever idea, which is to put a vibrator inside here. So the Poseidon folks are working with Kevin to license that technology. So not only do you get a bright flashing light, you get a brr, brr, gets your attention. And so one signal will be tell you to switch your mouthpiece position. And then when it does and it registers, it'll stop doing that. But it'll still be second signal, which is your dive is over, buddy. Time to go back to the surface.
What's it like to use? Have you used the DSV yet?
I've used the DSV quite a bit, and it breathes really nice, I have to say. Now this is just a prototype. It's made out of a different kind of a plastic and a bunch of other caveats. But just in conceptual form, it works marvelously. The ADV cracking pressure is spot on. The regulator breathes like a dream. It's one of the best open circuit regulators I've ever breathed on.
What about the whole system? You got it wet yet?
I haven't had it wet yet, but I'm told I'm going to have one out in Hawaii fairly soon, so I'll actually be able to have first-hand account of what it's like. But it's funny, actually, this is the first time I've seen it physically. They built in Sweden, and I live exactly halfway around the world in Hawaii. So I've seen SolidWorks models of every component of it. I've designed a lot of this in high detail, and this is the first time I ever actually got to see it. My very first reaction was, my God, that's small. You have no concept of how big it's going to be until you actually see it.
So when you get it wet, any chance of a post on rebreathing?
Oh, I might consider doing that. Yeah, I might consider doing that. Well, you'll definitely be hearing my opinions about it. Anyone who's ever paid attention to the internet, lately I haven't been very vocal, but everyone knows that I can't keep my opinions to myself. So you'll be hearing from me at some point.
Well, brilliant. Thanks very much for taking the time to talk to us.
Sure.
We really appreciate it.
Well, good. I'm glad. Yeah, and it's not what the diving world was expecting at a lot of levels, and I'll let Bill address that point a little bit more detail.
Brilliant. Thanks, Richard.
Okay, sir.